Hi everyone, my name is Rita Kakati-Shah and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life. So I was born and raised in England. My parents originally are from Assam, which is in the northeast of India. So they settled in the UK. My younger brother and I were born and bred with quite Assamese values actually. So we had the beauty of the Eastern and the Western world. We were educated in London. We grew up in a suburb actually in the northeast of London called Hornchurch, which was an amazing upbringing for us. We loved it. Went to school in London, university also. I studied mathematics and management at King's College London, and soon after began my career in the world of finance. So I worked at Goldman Sachs in London for about 10 years, and I worked in various roles really at the firm. The first was pan-European sales trading on the equities trading floor, when at the time I was actually one of very few women at the firm, and certainly on the trading floor. So I actually got quite involved in diversity and inclusion issues during my time at Goldman, initially with the Women's Network. Tried to really build up more of a platform where women from different areas could come together and get to know each other really on a professional setting. And also set up the Asian Professionals Network. It was something that was really near and dear to my heart, being of South Asian origin and seeing that there were folks from different parts of the world at the firm. But again, how do we get together and build some sort of a professional network for us? So did that. Worked in different areas at the firm, so I moved across to fixed income, to different project roles as well at the firm, and I absolutely loved my time there. It was my first and only job out of university. I think Goldman's were like my family. So after around 10 years time, I transitioned out into the pharmaceutical industry, and that was actually quite tough initially because, as I mentioned, Goldman was the only job I knew. But at the same time, I was ready for that transition because a family friend approached me one day and said, "Hey Rita, do you want to help me set something up to do with clinical trials and drug development in Delaware in the US?" And that was something that was brand new to me. He approached me because I had a business background, and for me that was refreshing and new. Whereas in the past, working at a multinational, I was very much used to all the dots being dotted and all of the T's being crossed. But that's very different when you're in a small firm. I remember, for example, one fine day, we were about to pitch to a client of ours. And I said to my colleague, and I said, "Hey, don't you think we should get these printed out in colour and ring bound?" So he looked at me and said, "Well, Rita, there's a FedEx Kinko's across the road." That for me was eye-opening because I was used to being in a multinational where I would just send an email and lo and behold, an hour or so later I would have a pile of presentations that I ordered and asked for. That's not real life. So that's some of the things that I got to learn about in a different world. And I was involved in business development, so I absolutely loved that. It meant traveling to different parts of the world, meeting key opinion leaders in the central nervous system, so anything to do with psychiatry, say depression, schizophrenia, and also to do with neurology, so Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease as well. So those were part of my days in the pharmaceutical industry. I soon moved to the US, New York, where I now live, after I got married. So when I got married, I started off in the US and I had an amazing time. And I have two small children now. My son is 7.5, my daughter is 5.5. And I took around 3.5, 4 years off to raise them. And I've got to tell you that by far, motherhood is the most challenging, trying job of all time. I mean, I thought banking was tough at times, working sometimes 24/7. I thought the pharmaceutical industry, crossing different time zones and traveling so often was tough. But oh my goodness, that was nothing compared to the joys of motherhood. You know, you are constantly sleep deprived, you are working 24/7 and then some, and you can never take a sick day. But not just that, the skills that you actually develop and build as particularly a mother are unparalleled. I joke all the time with people that if you can negotiate with a toddler or a child, there isn't anybody on this planet you can't take on. So take that next time you go to a boardroom meeting or a job interview. So that's really, in a nutshell, my journey up until founding of my company Uma, and that's really what spiraled the seeds and the journey for that. As a mother, as somebody who was thinking of then re-entry in the workforce, I couldn't help but see the challenges that so many, particularly women, face when they want to re-enter the workforce after taking some time off to raise their families. So that's when I thought, okay, I want to do something about this, and I started Uma. And Uma, the name actually comes from the Hindu goddess Uma. I call her the goddess of go-getting because she is a mother, she is a daughter, she is a sibling, she is a wife. So really she depicts confidence, determination, and great courage. So I thought, you know what, short and sweet name, easy to remember, but also what a deep meaning as well. So that's really why I named the company Uma. And what Uma does, it's really a global platform. It is an empowerment journey, a journey that really builds unshakable confidence, that inspires not just personal but professional success as well, and really that builds leadership and resilience in women and minorities in the workforce. So that's really why I started Uma. We are headquartered in New York. We also have offices in London, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Toronto. So some of the things that I really care about is my identity. I'm always first and foremost of Assamese origin, British by birth, and now I guess I'm American as well. So my identity is something that's a really core part of who I am. The fact is that I'm brown as well. I just totally embellish that, and I really talk to people all the time about my race, where I'm from, and the fact that I at some points am different and stand out, but also the fact that I'm a woman. You know, I'm very strong, and I've always advocated for women's rights, for gender equality, for pay equity, because of my own personal experiences in life as well. But also diversity and inclusion. How I even got into diversity and inclusion is because of my experiences from childhood and being used to being the odd one out and just not liking it really. So I'll give you an example. When I was at school as a child, so I was going back to 5 years old now, I was the only brown person in the room. So I was used to being the darkest one in the room. I got called names, very hurtful. When you're a child, you are not brought up to learn about these differences. But it was interesting and eye-opening, the fact that these would affect me and actually be quite hurtful at times too. Interestingly though, at the weekends, I danced. My parents signed me up for Bharatanatyam, which is a classical dance form from South India. So now, instead of being the darkest person in the room, I was now the fairest person in the room. And that was something that was very different for me as well. And again, I felt racism from a different perspective. These are from fellow sisters, fellow girls of mine too, but I wasn't invited to birthday parties, for example, just because of my skin tone. And that was tough and hard, especially as a young girl growing up. So these are some of the experiences that really shaped who I am. You know, I've lived this dual life as a child. You know, was I too dark? Was I too fair? Which one was I? And it was confusing having that as well. But the point being is that when people talk about race brackets, when people talk about diversity, it's not a monolithic example. You cannot just put everybody that's black or everybody that's brown and think their experiences are all the same. I've just given you an example right now where absolutely it's not the same. There are so many cultural nuances, there's so many environmental differences, there's so many examples of how everybody should be treated differently, but equally at the same time because of their backgrounds. So these are things that have really driven the work that I do, so much so that I get invited quite a lot to speak at overseas conferences, multinational companies, global policy forums, diversity and inclusion forums on my thought leadership and examples really of gender equality and what it means for the economy if women and men were put on the same par, and how it actually increases overall the GDP, and it would do if women were paid the same and put on the same pedestal, so to speak, as men currently are as well. but also from a race perspective. What can companies, what can cultures, what can policymakers do differently, not just to encourage diversity in the workforce, but that inclusiveness? What actually happens and how can you make that happen? Very, very different from diversity, but it goes hand in hand. I'll give you another example, actually. Quite recently, I was in Moscow giving a talk on diversity and inclusion, and I was greeted with a very large room. I'd say about 1,500 people in the room, of managers of large Eastern European companies, and they saw that I was of Indian origin. So, and India and Russia actually have a very good relationship. So they said, Rita, we're very, very diverse. We have lots of people from India come and work at our companies. So I said, great, I love the sound of that. So I asked the room, I said, how many of you have heard of the holiday Diwali? Quite a few hands went up in the room, which was great. I then asked the room, how many of you celebrate Diwali? And I think it was like a pin drop silence. Maybe one hand, two hands went up in the room. But that was my point of the difference between diversity and inclusion, and part of the messaging that I preach when I go to speak to different companies around the world. So something else I really, really care about is how women, particularly how mothers, are perceived in society. I'll give you an example. So when I was thinking of re-entering the workforce, after my two kids were at that age where I trusted somebody else to look after them, and they were getting to the age where I could start sending them to nursery and preschool, I went to a networking event in New York City. I signed myself up for this. I donned the only dress that fit me at the time, and I wore a pair of heels. I still remember getting dressed up to this very day. I went to the event, and everyone had to write a tag and put the place of work. So I put SAHM, standing for Stay at Home Mum, on my name tag. And one of the attendees there, another fellow woman, greeted me and asked me what that stood for. When I said Stay at Home Mother, I kid you not, she turned around and she walked away. And I was just completely taken aback at that point. I could have done one or two things right then. One, I could have just turned around and walked home. The door was right there. But I thought, you know what? I put so much effort into being here today. I want to know why she did that. So I actually went after her and I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, excuse me, so-and-so, we met a few minutes ago. Can I just ask why you reacted that way? Why you just turned around when I was in the middle of introducing myself? And she was so taken aback. I think obviously she was embarrassed by her reaction, but she had no idea that is how she reacted. Case in point, when you're a mother, when you are at home looking after your children, you feel quite like an ignored part of society. This was a fellow woman at a networking event where you're supposed to all be open and warm to that, and the opposite happened. And that's really why I always started this journey at UMA, to really open up these conversations and to open up these barriers that we have. So that was one of the reasons I really thought about starting UMA, because this was such a strong battle really to fight. I thought, why is that people see women who have taken time off as being next to nothing, like they've done nothing during the time on? Arguably it's the hardest job ever, and yet it gets belittled to almost nothing. So these are some of the things that I just deeply, deeply care about. So COVID and how that's impacted my family. So I've actually got a personal story there, because my whole family and we actually contracted COVID. I actually picked it up first, I think, in London. I was in the UK back in February for work, and I started just to feel a little achy, sneezed a bit, and had these headaches. And also I remember just feeling really, really tired. It almost reminded me of early pregnancy for both of my children, when sometimes you would be in mid-conversation and you just felt really tired. This overwhelming fatigue took over. So that's what I actually remember about it. But back then, that wasn't the symptoms that we were told to look out for. I remember turning on the TV or watching the news, and it was really that cough that people asked you to look out for, and a high temperature. I didn't have either of those symptoms. So I just went about my day felt unwell, but carried on going, went to my work events, carried on as usual, and felt better actually after a day or so. But every 2 or 3 days I would have exactly the same symptoms. So I started to sneeze again, I started to feel a bit achy, nothing major, and these really brutal headaches that would come and go as well. And again, went away, came back after another few days. This continued on and off for the couple of weeks that I was in the UK. When I came back to the States, and I actually made it back the day of the travel ban. So I came back, and a few days after I was back in the States again, my husband contracted the same symptoms that I had, plus he had the cough as well. So that was really what hit home then. He was diagnosed as being positive, and then the assumption, especially in the States, is that when one person has it in the family, the assumption is that everybody has it at that point. So then started our lockdown, our very strict quarantine, where we were just indoors, hunkered down, recovering. Whereas I had what I would call relatively mild symptoms, it was still really tough. You know, that fatigue was still there, the headaches were still there, the achiness doesn't make it easy to go about your day. But at the same time, I had 2 small children who are now very well immersed in homeschooling, and they're at the young age, 5 and 7, where I still had to very much get involved in the homeschooling. They're not just self-sufficient there yet, but also I was looking after my husband as well. I mean, where I was mild, he was more moderate to severe, I would say. He actually had to go to the emergency room a couple of times. So the gravity of this was actually fully felt. We had a very kind of tough experience with it, you know, trying to recover, trying to look after the kids, run a family, cook. I mean, I was used to traveling and ordering out a lot of the time. Now, all of a sudden, cooking meals at home every day with the very limited groceries and the rations we could get, because we couldn't go to the grocery store. We were in quarantine. We were relying on deliveries. But I don't know if anyone remembers or recalls back to March time, where the delivery slots just weren't there. You know, it was limited. So we were kind of struggling and going through all of that. And at the same time, just running UMA at the same time. I mean, that took a personal and a professional toll as well. Prior to the pandemic really hitting home, I would travel around the world delivering my keynotes, speaking to companies, speaking to policy, forums and professionals out there, but also delivering my trainings and the lessons and the empowerment journeys for the women, the minorities in the specific diversity and inclusion roles and equality out there. That suddenly stopped almost overnight, and it was tough. I'm not going to lie about that. But then what changed is we had to pivot. I started delivering my trainings online, started delivering talks via Zoom, and that became the new norm. Initially, it was a matter of just adjusting, but also about how can we think outside the box to do something that is just as empowering, that people can really resonate with, that you're doing in a different format. So that was all going on. Also launched my own TV show during quarantine. It's called The UMA Show, and really what that was about is empowering South Asian women and building up role models and voices for a part of the community that really hasn't had that in the past. So I was doing that at the same time. It's one of the many ways of pivoting and been so worthwhile. So that's really, in a nutshell, the COVID journey for me personally and professionally. So when I think about the future, I actually think the future for me was actually shaped during quarantine, during COVID, because in so many ways, the pivoting that had to happen for my business certainly started then. You know, lots of events have happened as well since quarantine. We are in the new norm. Everybody is remote right now, still pretty much. You know, slowly things are starting to open up, but that is the new norm. Previously, when it was unaccepted to work from home, part of the work we do at UMA is to convince companies to enable remote learning, remote working and flexibility for employees. Now that's become the norm. So that actually makes our job a little bit easier, but also it's opened people's eyes on how you can actually be efficient and effective from different circumstances as well. So when I think about the future, I think it to be more flexible, more open. People are more open-minded, but also there have been certain conversations that have been in the media recently about race relations, about diversity and inclusion, about how to create an inclusive workplace culture, how to be a better ally, how to be more understanding of different cultures. And I think recent conversations in the news and in the press have helped all of us, not just at companies on the professional level, but personally. How can we do a better job of having these conversations in our own kitchens at home and our own dining tables with our children, with our parents, with our peers? Because unless these conversations take place on a daily basis, unless we bring it up, nothing is going to change. And that's all we are about, Uma, is how do we enact change? How do we lay the path for the future to change? And I think these conversations have really started. So in a way, it's really helped to open up what was previously we were blind to, I think, from society for a very, very long time. So I think these conversations are really, really helpful. And I'm just optimistic. I've always seen life as the glass being half full. So I'm just really optimistic really about the future and how change is going to happen. Do I think it's really going to happen in my lifetime? You know, gender equality, equality between races and understanding different backgrounds. I don't know if it's going to happen then. But what I can say is that I have full faith that the conversations being nurtured now, the protocols, the policies that have been put in place is going to make a difference. But also, what can we do personally? We can speak to the next generation. I start with my own 2 children, but if everyone can start with young children, schools, education, that is shaping the next generation of leaders and thought leaders out there. That is the next generation of movers and shakers right there. And that's what forms their leadership. The thoughts that we have at home, the conversations that we have, is shaping how they think. What causes unconscious bias? It's something that stems in you, that comes from your upbringing, your childhood, conversations you had at home that you don't even think about. That just becomes how you think. So let's change that now. Let's change these biases by being aware of them from now. Everything has changed, absolutely. When we think about, can anything ever be the same again in the future? I think no, but that's good and that's bad in different ways. I think the good things about that is that we've learnt to be more resilient and persevering and just patient with everything, and we're seeing different angles. You know, I think one thing about me as being an entrepreneur is that I'm continually looking to create different angles in doing things. I've had to do that for my business. I've had to do that with my diversity inclusion work. But I think with other people too, everybody's having to change and shift the needle in what you're doing. Small businesses, some have closed, but others are pivoting. And I think it's those of us that are pivoting that are really starting to manage to stay afloat in this right now. I think what's one thing that I will remember from this whole experience is that we are a lot more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. And I think we shouldn't be scared of change. If anything, this is a time for all of us to embrace the fact that things are different. I mean, we're doing everything on Zoom these days. Everything is remote, but that's fine and that's normal right now. I remember before the pandemic days when we had to do like one Zoom call, there would be a bit of give and take, a bit of ifs and buts about, well, maybe we should do this in person. Now it's you won't even bat an eyelid. It's just what you do. So I think the world is changing. We are taking advantage of the cyber world, the digital world out there, and coming together, sort of the advancements in technology, in the medical world, in how people are coming together, policy forums. It's so impressive to see how everybody's coming together just to kind of make the world a better place. Folks are exchanging notes right now in what works in Europe. Does it work in the US? Does it work in Asia? What are you doing? What can we do better? That is an example of a changing economy as well, because we're all exchanging these ideas. And the same in the business sense, absolutely. Before, when people just used to look at their own regions, now everybody's going cross-border and it's beautiful. When people only talked about hiring people from certain parts of the world, or because of the certain backgrounds, people are going across and saying, well, do you have a different background in a different area, for example? So we're really finding a way to nurture and nourish our differences in order to move forward in the future. So I think in terms of what has or hasn't changed and what does the future hold, I think the future holds everything. Let's sort of embrace it. Let's not be scared of the different changes, really.